Thank you, Ambassador Albright. It's good to have you back in the room with us. And I was going to go first to Mr. DeSoto with a question. I just remember some of the work that you were doing in Egypt some years ago, and your frustration at the time with the lack of commitment to reform. And I think it was the Mubarak administration that asked you to leave the country. I wondered if you were in the process of advising them on the need to address this issue, and corruption was a part of the issue. But I wondered if you could go through that dialogue, because I think it was interesting in terms of what you found in Cairo at the time and what the response of the Mubarak government was at the time, in order to give us an understanding of the lack of adjustment to rights in these societies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we were called in the year about 1999 and started a project in the year 2000 that went into 2005 by the government, and we reported directly to the Prime Minister and to the Ministry of the Treasury. And the general idea was to draft the laws that would allow a population that was about 60 to 64%, maybe 40%, depending how you calculate it, but it was 85% of enterprise and involved 92% of all plots of land to come to the legal sector, because it didn't have all those that information and those tools that property gives, which allows it to combine and create wealth. Well, the proposal was actually accepted by the Council of Ministers, and it was made operational. It just had one problem. It was that we had insisted that we had to get rid of the notion that property is real estate. Property is the condition under which you hold and exchange things. It's a much bigger phenomenon. Before, you Americans, for example, are able now to have title insurance. You've got titles, you've got deeds, you've got paper, whatever you've got. You have got about 4 generations of reforms that, first of all, made that paper credible. You had a constituency for property even before you had a full democracy. You had homesteading, you had preemption acts where Congress turned down certain opinions of the Supreme Court, and you made sure that people got into the place first, and that's how you started identifying them, because they had to have property before they could vote. So property has to come in more or less at the same time. And then you had manifest destiny. The whole thing was manifest destiny worked because you empowered people in the country, and they had dead animals on their heads, if I recall Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, and the Arabs have rags on their heads. And those are the constituents of a market economy when they came in. So the general idea was, are the existing property rights institutions, what they called property rights, the ones to carry the reforms? And the reply is they're not, because what is happening in the Middle East is not just about growth. It is essentially the Industrial Revolution. These people walking on the streets are essentially protesting about their rights being there. We have the films, whether we were going to show if we would have had the time, but they're going to be on record, the forms of what these people said at the time that they were lighting up and dying. There was no religious invocation. There was no political invocations. In the case of Bouazizi, he said, I want to see the poor people have the right to buy and sell. Everything had to do with all of the symptoms that you have with what we call industrial revolution. That is to say, the passing of one society to another where you work at a much larger scale. So the issue at this time is not property rights, which is what the Egyptian government and Mubarak tried to do with our plans. It's having the rights to property rights. It's meta rights. It's what you first did all throughout the 19th century. Do Afro-Americans have the right to the rights? It isn't that you didn't have property law. It's who had the right to it. And did the settlers have it? So that's the issue, and that means the following thing. That means that one of the recommendations that I came with is that those reforms that actually made the United States, as we have studied them, were not technical reforms. They were essentially political reforms. And I think when one doesn't understand that in the Middle East, what you're talking about is essentially a emerging class of people who are acting alone for the moment, but have been the only ones to be able to mobilize a rebellion throughout all of the all of the Middle East, you're not going to be able to grasp it. You've got to be able to have politicians that are able to see, for example, when it comes to unemployment, that there is none of that unemployment. If you're poor in the Middle East, if you're poor, and you are as poor as Mr. Bouazizi, and you are not employed for more than 3 months, you're dead because you've got no way to feed yourself. So all those people are not unemployed. They're like your early settlers. They're working. They're just working outside the law. The question is, how do you make them come in? How do you then change the basic for statistics in countries throughout the world, like us in the third world, where the International Labor Organization gives you 2 categories, employed and unemployed? How about employed formally, making your own way through life, and then employees? There's a third category, which is a huge category, which is, as a matter of fact, about 380 million Arabs who have invented their own way of creating wealth. Just 2 images might help us confuse what may sound very confusing. Steve Jobs had an Arab father. Bouazizi had an Arab father. Both of them were adoptive fathers. Steve Jobs went to school because his father was able to mortgage that garage 3 times because he had a property right, and that put him through school. Bouazizi, we've got the whole history of how he tried to get mortgages, and he couldn't, and he therefore couldn't get access to credit and couldn't get anywhere. Entrepreneurs are as good as their legal environment, and the legal environment of the Middle East is very bad, and it's not going to be solved by technicians because this is not a technical problem. This is essentially a civilization that we've seen in Latin America based on old ideas that are anti-market, and poor people are the ones that are adopting market ideas, and it's not coming through universities.
Thank you, Mr. De Soto. Let's go to Mr. Deutsch.